The German philosopher Martin Heidegger once stated, "Thinking that cannot think the truth is no thinking at all." So let us think about this for a moment, which will hopefully help us answer the question whether modern science thinks. When we say a word like truth, it feels simple at first, almost transparent, as if the word is pointing to something solid, something already there, waiting to be named. We grow up with that assumption without noticing it. A statement is either false or true. A fact is either correct or incorrect. Language is treated as a kind of clear window. If we look through it properly, we see reality as it is. But have you asked yourself, what exactly are you seeing through that window? Because the moment we slow down and look at how we actually use these words in everyday life, something strange appears. We say something is true, but what we usually mean is that it fits what we already believe, or it matches what we can verify, or it agrees with what others also accept. The word stays the same, but its ground keeps shifting quietly underneath it. So the question is not whether truth exists or not. The question is, how does this word manage to stay stable while its meaning keeps moving? At first, this does not feel like a problem. Language still works, we communicate, we agree, we disagree. Everything continues as normal. But then a small tension begins to appear, because the word truth is used in completely different ways depending on where it appears. In everyday speech, it means honesty. In science, it means verification. In law, it means evidence. In religion, it means something closer to revelation. And yet we act as if all these uses point to the same thing. Do they? Or are we simply using one word to hold together very different experiences? This is where something subtle begins to happen. We start to rely less on what the word reveals and more on the system in which it is used. A sentence is not true because of what it shows, but because it fits the rules of a method, a discipline, a framework. So slowly, without noticing it, truth begins to depend on structure rather than presence. And if truth depends on the framework that defines it, who decides the framework? And more importantly, does truth still mean the same thing once it depends on something outside of itself? At this point, language still behaves normally on the surface. We can still argue, define, prove, correct, etc. But something has already changed in the background. Because now, truth is no longer something we simply encounter. It is something that must be produced correctly inside of a system. And if something must be produced correctly, then it is no longer simply there, in the same way it once felt like it was. We do not yet question truth itself, but we begin to question how truth is being handled. And that is already a shift we cannot easily reverse. Because once truth is tied to a method, to verification, to systems of agreement, another assumption enters. That reality is always available in the form of something that can be represented correctly. We do not say this explicitly. We barely even notice it. But it begins to guide everything. A fact becomes something that can be checked. Knowledge becomes something that can be organized. understanding becomes something that can be completed. And slowly the world becomes less like something we are inside and more like something we are observing from a distance, arranging into clarity. At first, this feels like progress, but there is a moment, very small, almost invisible, where you might ask yourself, if everything becomes clearer through this process, why does the act of understanding itself feel more and more distant from what is actually being understood? And if truth is always arriving through a system, what is it that the system never fully captures? This question does not stay still, because the more we rely on systems to stabilize truth, the more reality itself begins to appear as something that must be processed before it can be known. And once that happens, the focus shifts from what is true to how we are allowed to know what is true. From there, something else begins to take shape. Not yet a definition, not yet a concept, but a way of approaching everything that will soon become unavoidable. At some point, language is no longer just describing things, it begins to organize them. We stop asking what something is in itself and start asking how it can be measured, classified, or made useful inside a system of knowledge. This shift does not announce itself. It feels like progress, like clarity. But something subtle happens in the process. The world begins to appear less like something we are living inside and more like something we are looking at from the outside. A human being is no longer just a person. They become a set of physiological patterns. A society is no longer a living structure. It becomes data, behavior, and models. Nature is no longer something we dwell in. It becomes resources, systems, and functions. Nothing has disappeared. Everything is still there. But something has changed in the way it is approached. We no longer encounter things directly. We encounter them through a method. And a method, by definition, does not let things appear as they are. It only lets them appear in the form it can handle. It is no longer only what is true, it becomes what can be made visible under the conditions we have set. At first, this feels harmless. After all, measurement works, prediction works, technology works, medicine works, psychology helps people, economics organizes systems. Nothing seems wrong, or so it appears. But there is a strange effect underneath all of this working. The more precise the systems become, the more the original thing seems to withdraw. A person becomes more understandable but less present. A society becomes more measurable but less graspable. A piece of land becomes more usable but less experienced. It is as if clarity increases but contact decreases, and yet we continue. Because the system does not ask whether it captures reality fully. It only asks whether it works. So gradually, we begin to accept a hidden rule that what cannot be measured correctly is less real than what can. This rule is never written anywhere. No one has agreed on it. It simply emerges from how knowledge is practiced. And once this happens, something very important begins to disappear from view, not as a concept, but as an experience. Because everything that is brought into the system must first be translated into something the system can handle. A feeling becomes a data set. A decision becomes a model. A human situation becomes a variable among other variables. But what happens to what does not translate? Is it false? Is it incorrect? Or is it simply something that does not fit in the format in which understanding is now required to appear? Because the system continues to function, it continues to produce results, it continues to extend its reach, and as long as it works, questioning its ground feels unnecessary. But there is a moment where something slightly disorients us. It happens when we notice that the same method used to understand life is also used to simplify it. Maybe not intentionally, and definitely not violently, but structurally. Because anything that enters a method must first be made compatible with it. And compatibility always reduces something. So slowly the question shifts again. It is no longer only about truth. It is no longer only about knowledge. It begins to concern the act itself of turning what is living into something that can be handled, that can be measured. Because everything that becomes an object of knowledge must first stop being encountered as it is. It must be placed at a distance, made stable, made repeatable, made available for inspection. And in that process, something essential changes. Not in what we know, but in how knowing itself behaves. But this is not seen clearly, because the system is successful, and success hides its own conditions. So the question does not disappear. It appears as a small discomfort. Why does everything we understand so clearly begins to feel slightly less real? Because if everything must pass through a method to become known, and if everything that passes through a method is already transformed, then what exactly are we encountering when we say we know something? Not as a theory, but as a lived act of understanding itself. And here, for the first time, a strange pressure appears, not toward more knowledge, but toward something that does not behave like knowledge at all. Something that does not complete the system, but interrupts its closure. Something that is not produced by the method, but becomes visible when the method reaches its limit. And once that pressure appears, it can no longer be ignored, because the question is no longer what we know. It is what happens in the very moment we try to know at all.